Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday, and welcome to another episode of The Triumphs and Travails of Jeffersonian Republic. This is episode 2, where we will be discussing, again, the two Thomas Jeffersons. Um, as we know, the Democratic Republicans were opposed to a strong standing army. We saw this with the Whiskey Rebellion, where Jefferson was incredibly critical of the large use of force that President Washington used to crush the rebellion in Pennsylvania. We'll be looking at those values as compared to the military expansion Jefferson used during his 8 years as president, specifically focusing on the Barbary Wars. We'll look at how the anti-federalist Jefferson, while before he was president, was opposed to strong federal control of commerce, and yet, as part of his foreign policy plan, put a devastating embargo, the Embargo Act of 1807, on pretty much all of foreign trade. And we'll round off by looking at how, even though the anti-federalists were antagonistic to industrialism, that through this embargo, Jefferson actually did more to expand American industry than the Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, who was supportive of it. So, as I had mentioned, the Jefferson platform or attitude towards a large standing army has already been made clear. What Jefferson viewed as a great risk to republicanism, this idea that a strong standing military would allow some kind of despotic leader to quickly seize control and destroy the republic, actually was once again put in contrast with the pragmatism of the conditions that Jefferson faced as president. When he first entered the White House, Jefferson did want to reduce the military and made some efforts to scale back the size of the American military. The notion that he wanted to win friends through peaceful coercion, using non-military measures for foreign policy and diplomacy, as opposed to the use of force. So to reduce the size of America's military. However, Jefferson inherited the realities of American commerce, which was that we were still a very small nation, and one whose economic interests weren't respected by the bigger players of Europe, one of those being the North African pirates of the Barbary states in the Mediterranean, who plundered and blackmailed merchant ships that ventured into that particular region of trade. War across the Atlantic had not been a part of Jefferson's vision. And so even though he began his presidency scaling back the size of the military, it wasn't very long before Jefferson actually built a stronger naval force. Now, being a fiscal conservative, Jefferson focused on the construction of smaller, lighter weight ships, single gun ships instead of giant man-of-war type of navy. But Jefferson justified this in the sense that a navy was less of a threat to republicanism than an army, that navies were meant to protect us internationally, where an army could be used to pose a domestic threat. At any rate, you're looking at a map of the Barbary states in green along the coast of North Africa. And a popular image here of a war between the American Navy, the Marines, and the crew of the frigate Philadelphia. In 1804, the Tripolitan pirates had captured this ship, the Philadelphia, and were preparing to use it against Americans. In a daring exploit that ensured his lasting fame and became one of America's first great war stories, 24-year-old naval officer Stephen Decatur slipped into the harbor of Tripoli and, at great risk to his life and the life of his men, burned the frigate to the waterline, denying it to the pirates. And so this particular story, really became the a great story about American military success early on in the Republic's existence. Here we can see the Philadelphia burning as Tripolitan pirates stand by. It speaks to just how small or how kind of insignificant American military or American might was in the early days of the Republic. We weren't the international super nation that we are today. When Jefferson was reelected in 1804, this time it was pretty much without too much of a contest. He raced against Charles Pinckney, who had been President Adams' running mate in 1800. With his success of a second term, foreign issues, international competition, and troubles on the high seas again reared its ugly head. At the same time, Napoleon Bonaparte provoked a new war with Britain. This would be a conflict that lasted 11 years and threatened to pull the United States once again into a European war where they stood little to no chance of success. While France dominated the continent of Europe, Britain still mastered the seas. And although the United States enjoyed unrestrained commercial pickings for the first 2 years of this conflict, eventually London issued what became known as the Orders in Council in 1806. What London did was it tried to close off all ports, or it made it, by their decree, illegal to trade or bring any kind of products into harbors that were controlled by France. So literally, all ports along the western Atlantic coast of Europe, which had been taken by Napoleon's armies, were now closed, and any ship trying to bring goods into those ports were considered enemies by Britain and were subject to confiscation. And the soldiers or the sailors on those ships were threatened with impressment. Napoleon struck back at this decree and ordered the seizure of all merchant ships that were headed towards British ports. And so America was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Again, at the mercy of these two superpowers. Its best interest was to remain neutral, but both countries would not allow for unrestrained or unhampered commerce with their enemy. Hopefully by now you have a sense of what this term impressment means, that a enemy would seize not only the cargo of a ship, but also take its crew under forced labor, forced conscription of sailors. In total, during this 11-year conflict between France and Britain, some 6,000 U.S. citizens were impressed by Britain. Most notoriously was the Chesapeake Affair, which took place in 1807. 12 miles off the coast of Virginia, a British frigate stopped a U.S. frigate, the Chesapeake, and demanded 4 alleged deserters from London. They had never claimed a right to seize American sailors before, but in this particular case, when the American commander refused the demand of the British warship fired 3 devastating broadsides at close range, killing 3 Americans and wounding 18 of the crew. They ultimately seized the 4 alleged deserters and sailed off. The Chesapeake did not sink. It limped back to port. Now, while Britain had never established its right to take American sailors or to attack American vessels that didn't comply with its particular rules of war, This event became kind of a battle cry or a rallying cry, especially amongst American Federalists who wanted to see this event avenged. The British were clearly wrong. In fact, eventually London even admitted it and offered reparations to repay the crew and the owners of the Chesapeake for the damages. However, this was of little consequence to Americans who wanted to avenge the blood that had been spilled. Honor would not permit submission to the British or the French mistreatment. But once again, America was not ready for war. Okay, we've seen and we've heard the admonishments of President Washington, who really warned the United States about the risk of long-term military engagements in European affairs or permanent alliances. And Washington and Adams really steered us away from those types of engagements. Even though Jefferson, especially during Washington's administration, had been a big advocate for military action on the behalf of the French people. But as president, we see Washington follow the tradition we see Jefferson follow the tradition of Washington and Adams, and in trying to find a non-militant way of responding to these foreign affairs. So Jefferson, instead of declaring war against Britain, believes that the warring nations need the United States for raw material and foodstuffs, and is going to use that position, our position as a supplier, to our advantage to punish the two nations who had been so negligent of American maritime rights. So Jefferson believed that if America cut off exports, the offending powers would relent. He convinces Congress to issue the Embargo Act of 1807, which basically forbade any export or import of all goods from the United States, whether in American or foreign ships, period. So in other words, he places a worldwide or European-wide embargo, believing that this is ultimately going to harm France and England worse. This embodies Jefferson's idea of peaceful coercion. But was it successful? No, absolutely not. Well, it hurt one country for sure, us. American economy was devastated by the embargo long before Britain or France began to bend. An enormous illicit or illegal trade mushroomed in 1808, especially along the Canadian border. New England merchants, not wanting to participate in the sacrifice it would take to economically retaliate against these two nations, engaged in basically a black market trade with British Canada. The embargo revived, opposition to the embargo revived the nearly dead Federalist Party as the election of 1808 appeared. And on March 1st, 1809, 3 days before Jefferson retires and leaves office, Congress repealed the Embargo Act and replaced it with a less intense version, a watered-down version, the Non-Intercourse Act, which formally opened trade again with all nations except Britain and France. Now, that would scale back some of the consequence somewhat. However, considering that Britain and France were our major trade partners, it didn't totally alleviate the pain of the embargo. This became a very famous political cartoon, the Cursed Oh Grab Me. You can see here two individuals, President Jefferson and a New England merchant. And the Cursed Oh Grab Me, which is the word embargo backwards, attacks an American merchant carrying a barrel of superfine sugar to a British merchant ship. The turtle represents the slowed growth of the American economy. And you can see here President Jefferson, represented from a Federalist perspective, taking great joy in the harm the "oh grab me" is causing American merchants. The Embargo Act failed because Jefferson underestimated British determination in its conflict, economic warfare against France. He also overestimated the dependence both France and England had on American trade. France had the rest of Europe under its control and was capable of replacing American trade goods, at least in the interim. And Britain, of course, master of the seas, was capable to resume its trade for the most part without too much hindrance. Jefferson also miscalculated how unpopular a self-sacrificing weapon like an embargo would be amongst Americans. While they were outraged and seemingly ready to go into military conflict, the economic consequences of the embargo were much more difficult for the American people to accept. The Embargo Act didn't totally destroy the American economy, however. Ironically, New England plucked new prosperity from the jaws of the Embargo Act. Resourceful Yankees reopened old factories and erected new ones to replace its trade and importation of manufactured goods from especially England. The foundations of modern American industrial might laid behind a protective wall of the embargo, meaning now Americans were pretty much restricted to buying American manufactured goods from New England. This is ironic because Jefferson was an avowed critic of factories. As an anti-federalist, Democratic Republicans typically favored laws that would benefit independent farmers and the South, and yet the embargo had a greater impact on New England manufacturing than any of Hamilton's policies during the administration of Washington and Adams. So to recap this section, once again, we're looking at two different Thomas Jeffersons. One as a founding father opposed to a strong standing military, and yet as president expanding the Navy and using the military for the first time in going out and pursuing naval rights against the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. Second, strong opposition to the control of commerce at the federal level, yet Jefferson passes this devastating Embargo Act on Europe in the Embargo Act of 1807. And lastly, the fact that Democratic Republicans had traditionally supported the rights of small independent farmers and were most popular in the South and the West, and yet the Embargo Act did a lot to expand the infant American industrial to expand the infant American industry.